Hi, everyone. My name is Thomas Sargent, and this is for the WebGIS class that we're all part of, and I'm excited to share some of the content that I've been working on here. So as you can see on the screen here, this is about the state of Alabama, specifically some geology that informs a lot of human action in the area. Um, I think we like to talk about GIS, and a lot of what we've focused on in this course has to do with looking at these maps or making maps and using them to figure out what's going on right now, or more typically using them to predict something in the future. Figuring out routing for some shipping thing or transportation like Uber, or modeling where wildfires are going to go or the extent of some invasive species or something. But I think a really important part of GIS is also looking at the past and how that informs the present and the future. So, what this project is meant to show is how sort of basic underlying conditions, geography, geology, the terrain, what's in the soil, can inform where we live, how we live, what the economy is like, and how all those things downstream can trickle into who's living where and how they feel about things, and ultimately, in the purpose for the purposes of this project, showing the proportion of Democrat versus Republican votes in Alabama, which really seems to just come down to rock history, which is pretty interesting. Uh, so, first thing I just want to say before getting into the GIS is that this might sound pretty familiar to you. I know we probably all love maps and stare at maps online, so it might sound pretty familiar to something that you may have seen on Reddit or someplace like that. This is adapted from something by Starkey Comics, and I have a link for that on all these, the hub, the story map, all that, if you want to check it out. But on Comics, there was this interesting graphic that showed that the um, Cretaceous sediments, like the lines of these different sediments in the state, later informed different kinds of blackland prairie soil. And where the soil was most sort of robust and fertile, that was where farming concentrated. Naturally, Alabama, the American South, where the good soil was and all the farm concentrations were, also meant that this is where the slave populations were most highly concentrated. That in turn, through time, lack of mobility, social injustices, uh, those African Americans weren't able to leave the area. So to this day, this belt of sediment is where a lot of Black people live in the state of Alabama. And um, as a result, this is also the same sort of now blue belt, not a black belt, of where people generally tend to vote democratically because they're African American. Uh, so it's just this sort of interesting series of correlations through time, where the geology informs the sediment, informs the soil, informs farming, informs the economic practices, informs the plantations, the slave labor, the black population, and then the behaviors of that black population. Uh, I just wanted to share those correlations a little bit through a more sort of more technical, high res, better powered GIS means. So, to that end, as we know for this project, there are a lot of requirements. Don't need to get into all of them, but I do have a web map that supports all this. I have this story map to help tell the story that you can go through in your own time. Um, I have a web app through Experience Builder as well, if you want to play around with data a little bit, and I'll get into that a little bit more in a moment. And then also a hub page, of course, that tries to just store all this so we know where it is. Um, so, um, First thing I want to talk about is just going through that correlation a little bit more, and then I can get into the data and the layers and the workflow and all that a little bit more. Uh, so I mentioned that Alabama has this black belt that actually refers to the soil from that Cretaceous period where the sediments built up when this was an inland sea. It actually results in this sort of band or belt through the middle of the state with this very rich, dark black soil that is well suited to growing, much better than anywhere else in the state. Very nutrient rich, right? Uh, and there are these different bands that go about the state. They go across into Mississippi and other states. but Alabama has this very sort of stark concentration of it right across the middle of the state, sort of in a west-east line in the middle. Uh, this is known as the Black Lands or the Black Belt, and the name is sort of stuck just because of that propagation through history, like I told you, and how it's now a predominantly African American area. But it also is denoted by a major land resource area. That's sort of like a federal designation for the territory. Uh, Now, before getting into any of that more, I do think since this is a GIS class, I should talk about the GIS a little bit more. Uh, I pulled all this data through ArcGIS Online. Some of it already sort of was prefab, um, but I did have to do some, adaptation of metrics. I rescaled things, I recolored them. Some might have to be inverted so that they would sort of be of the same valence with other variables. A lot of this was just generally pulling existing work, like things from the U.S. Census Bureau to determine, where African Americans are, or average farm sizes, things like that, and um, adapting them a little bit myself on ArcGIS Online or through ArcGIS Pro, so that I could then re-upload them as new hosted feature layers. If you are looking for that hosted feature layer, that's the one called um, Alabama 2020 census data. That's what I called it. And the idea there is that you can see all these different layers of geology and farm size and black population concentration, that sort of thing. And then you can play around with layering that with census data to see how these historical variables inform other demographic variables today. Uh, I also found a neat tiled imagery layer. I couldn't quite find much GIS level information on the population or concentration of slave populations back then. But I was able to find an interesting image that somebody else had uploaded, sort of just a tiled imagery layer that sort of overlays over the state. And that can show you where the concentrations are. Kind of cool and just a neat inclusion, I think. Uh, so I pulled a lot of this data and the feature layers and things from a number of different sources. I've laid all those out on Hub and Story Maps. Don't need to talk through them now. But they are, everything part of this project is shared. It's online, available to everyone. You can manipulate it. Again, that census data is what I set up with a lot of editing widgets and that sort of thing in case you want to play around with the data a little bit. Um, but there is a lot that you can do with this. Essentially, though, it does just boil down to layering a lot of images on top of one another so that you can see the relationships between these different things through time. Uh, so, within this black belt, the Black Lands, this part of Alabama, you can see that because of the soil, the farms are very, very large. And even if you look at census data today, the average farm sizes are still much larger in this area than anywhere else in the state. I would assume that this has to do with the fact that there were historically very large plantation estates here, owners who had large, large amounts of property, and those properties still have never really been subdivided or sold off in any amount to this day. So you can still see that the farms are much larger today, and you can also see that the proportion of the black population is much higher in this area as well. And I did have to adjust some variables, speaking of portions and percentages, because a lot of census information is in terms of the total population, and a lot of these other layers and data that I found also have to do in terms of sums and counts. So, just some simple calculations, some stuff in Arcade to, make things not out of the total in terms of sums and counts, but out of percentages of that total. So while, for example, there might, nominally, numerically be more black people in Birmingham as a proportion of the overall population, there are actually much more black people in this black that I'm talking about. Uh, Ultimately, though, if you pull all this information together, as I sort of explained in the beginning, tracing it through history, you will find that this black belt has a much higher concentration of African Americans than anywhere else in the state. And naturally, as you might guess, those African Americans are more inclined to vote blue or Democratic. So that as you look at the sort of final graphic that I produce in these overlaying that sediment belt and historical variables with Democratic voter trends, you can see that the bluest parts of the states are right here, right where the slaves used to be, right where the plantations used to be, right where the best soil is, right where all the geology made this happen. I think it's just a very interesting case of how past or geologic or geographic circumstances actually can control and direct our human behavior. Uh, so there's a lot more information on this, the exact methodologies used, workflows, that sort of thing that's available on Hub, at Story Maps, and through the app and through the map and everything we had to do for this. Uh, but I think this is just a very interesting sort of social exercise in GIS because a lot of what we look at is sort of just how do we model this or show it, and it might look very cool, but we have to remember we want to make things that are actionable or insightful. And I think this is a very interesting way to see how Alabama today is a result of Alabama yesterday, and Alabama millions, hundreds of millions of years ago, due to geologic forces. So feel free to check out all those resources. Hopefully, this is pretty interesting to you as well.